Greetings. Recently, someone asked me if I was familiar with Pastor Kelly Richardson, and I replied honestly that I was not familiar with him at all. However, as a quick disclaimer, let me state that I do not intend that in any way as impugning his popularity or his significance. I was later told that at a recent significant Israelite conference, he was on the same panel as Divine Prospect and Zion Lex and Akwete Bezalama. So I would take that to mean that he's someone significant and someone important within the Israelite spectrum. I just want to make that clear that my unfamiliarity with him merely speaks to my own limited experience. Having said that, I was told that I might find him interesting as I'm a low-level student of Semitic languages who's also interested in some aspects of the linguistic side of the Israelite spectrum, and I was told that Pastor Kelly Richardson employs Lashon Kodash, or a perhaps closely related variant of Lashon Kodash. And I was also told that he has a video on the subject of the claim that there's Hebrew cursive in the pews of the First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. So, I mean, that's a subject that I'm interested in. I wrote a tiny bit on it in Vocab Malone's forum on Facebook, but I figured I might be able to contribute a little bit to a video on the subject as well. I'm no expert on the subject, but I have a tiny bit of familiarity, or at least some thoughts to share on it. So I found this video here titled Exposed, the Erasing History, and it's a video from May of last year. So I wanted to play a couple clips from this video starring Pastor Kelly Richardson, and I'll share some thoughts. So here we go. Listen to this.
I want to say Shalom. I'm here at the First African Baptist Church here down in Savannah, Georgia. So this is the church that have ancient Hebraic writings here. Here's one of the pews. Do y'all see that? That is one of the pews. Let me show you another one of the pews. This is the information that they want to blot out. This is the information that they don't want us to know about. But I wanted to show you again. These are the pews right here. These are the pews. These are the pews. Look at the writing. Look at the ancient writings. These are writings from our ancestors back in the 1700s, the 1800s. You know, how is it that our ancestors back in 1773 was writing in a Hebraic language at a time where as though Hebrew supposedly was redeveloped or rediscovered back in 1855? How were they able to do this?
If I can chime in here very quickly, first let me state that I'm not entirely certain about what Pastor Richardson's stance is here, because in the video at one point he referred to it as ancient Hebrew, at another point he referred to it as cursive Hebrew. I believe he even uses the phrase ancient cursive Hebrew. Nonetheless, it's my understanding the popular claim about what appears in that church is that it's cursive Hebrew. Now, regarding a redevelopment or rediscovery of the Hebrew language in the 19th century, it seems to me that it needs to be clarified that what took place was a number of Hebraists, foremost amongst them being Eliezer ben Yehuda, but others as well, played a role in helping the Hebrew language transition back into being a spoken language, because it was pretty much just a liturgical language for quite a few centuries, for many centuries. However, that does not entail just complete worldwide ignorance of Hebrew prior to it returning to a spoken language, and it certainly does not entail complete worldwide ignorance of the Hebrew cursive script. Now, I don't know the date of the markings on those pews, but nonetheless, just assuming for the sake of argument that they predate the time of Ben Yehuda, it should be noted that there were plenty of people using the Hebrew cursive script prior to that time. It was used by many Yiddish speakers in their writing, so too in Ladino, the Hebrew cursive script was used. So I just wanted to clarify that point, and I'm going to come back to it. The presence of the Hebrew cursive script does not entail the presence of Hebrew. That's number one. But more importantly, the resurrection of Hebrew as a living language, as a spoken language, has nothing to do with knowledge of the Hebrew cursive script prior to that point. Okay, but let's return to the video.
Let me show you some more of these writings here. Look at here. Look at these writings. Look at these writings. Let me show you another pew here. Look at these writings. See, the enemy, the system of man, want to erase these landmarks that I'm showing you. They don't want us to know about these things. Now let's see the language here again. All right. See, history will tell us that our ancestors were what? Illiterate. No, it just means that they didn't speak the English language. They were very literate, all right, as you can see here. See, when you hear the term, for example, massa means oppressor, all right? Not what we were thinking. We were thinking that, hey, the slaves, when they say massa, they speaking a broken language. No, they're not speaking broken English. They actually were speaking what? Hebrew, but massa means oppressor.
I've seen others make this claim on the internet. If I'm understanding Pastor Richardson's argument correctly, if not, he or one of his supporters can correct me afterwards in the comment sections or a subsequent video. But assuming I understand him correctly, he's connecting it to the word masa, which is spelled mem sin aleph. Honestly, I don't see the connection. I understand when it's transliterated in certain ways, it looks similar, but it seems to me that the word massa is really from the word master. There's nothing implausible about that, as we see that throughout the English language, where, for example, the ER at the end of a word will get pronounced like an A. I mean, there's people who pronounce water as wada. There's people who pronounce over as ova, like look over there, And, of course, the English language has much more unfortunate or infamous or vulgar examples of words that end with ER being pronounced as if with an ah sound instead. But perhaps the best analogy would be with the word faster, which is pronounced by some as fassa. I mean, I think that's a fairly straightforward analogy. I'm going to play a song put together by a fan of Usain Bolt. It's a tribute to Usain Bolt. And notice how many times he renders the word faster as fassa.
You see him fast and your queen fast and your cat can be a shrink. You see him bowl fast and you think him faster than the stone where you fling in the water, faster than how that sink. Him faster than the rain where you fall on the roof as the water run off of the zinc. You see him faster than the strike of the lighter before you see fire. Him faster than the flint, say you see him faster. Faster than the step where you make, faster than the breath where you take. Him faster than the run where you running and the valley, faster than your sweat get you wet. Said him faster, faster than the speed of a troops, faster than the look where you look. You see him faster than the lyrics where flow to me brain, transit to me writing book. You saying bold, him so fast, him so speedy.
Now, I understand if one might wish to object that that clip was from a different country, a different English-speaking country, but nonetheless, the point is that within the English language, there's nothing implausible about words that end with ER, losing that sound and being replaced with an ah sound. It clearly happens in some places with the word faster, and therefore there's nothing implausible about master being pronounced massa by certain English speakers. I don't see a compelling reason to think that those who were using the word were speaking Hebrew. And I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I honestly fear that we may be moving in a circle if we buttress the claim that they were using a Hebrew word by presupposing that they were Hebrew speakers, and yet at the same time trying to cite the alleged use of this Hebrew word as evidence that they were Hebrew speakers. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what Pastor Richardson was doing, but that's the feeling I've gotten from others who have taken this approach, from what I've seen on the internet. But anyway, let's get back to Pastor Richardson's video.
I'm going to sit down here. See, it's all on the pews. Let me show you again. Let me show you again. Here's another pew. Come out to this place. This is a bookmark that our ancestors made it a point to leave behind a breadcrumb that no one to this day can erase, no matter how much they try to erase it. Try to erase this. People are trying to erase it right now. They try not to call this ancient cursive Hebrew. They're not trying to call it as it is, ancient cursive Hebrew, and some actually classified it as ancient Aramaic, right? But now the agenda is trying to classify this as Arabic. This is not Arabic.
Okay, so that covers what I'm going to show from that video, and now I can get into my thoughts on the assertion, the position that cursive Hebrew appears in the pews of this church in Savannah, Georgia. I'd like to begin by addressing his statement that those who assert that it may be Arabic are attempting to erase the truth. What I wanted to say is that the discussion on whether or not a particular language appears in the markings on those pews and whether or not that language is Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or something else should be conducted without impugning the motivations of others. What I'll say is that I have seen at least one website state that it may be Arabic. I'm not endorsing that position, nor am I endorsing the position that Hebrew appears there either, just to be clear. Nonetheless, what I will say as a preliminary point is that whether or not a certain language is present should be determined based on the structure of the markings themselves. And this is precisely why we can have this sort of discussion separate from any question about the motivations of others. For example, suppose you had a newspaper in front of you and you know the English language. If someone says that newspaper is written in Spanish or French or Vietnamese or English, at the very least, if you know English and you're literate in English, you would be able to determine whether or not English is present on the front page of that newspaper. And you don't need to speculate about the motivations of the people making the relevant claims about what appears on that newspaper. You can simply look at the structure of the text and determine whether or not English is present. And it should be noted that the languages that I mentioned, Vietnamese, Spanish, French, English, all use the Latin script. So merely pointing to a character pointing to a marker or some sort of a marking that's similar to a character used in the Latin script, that in itself would not be sufficient. That by itself would not be sufficient to demonstrate the presence of English or Vietnamese or Spanish or French. Rather, you would need something more than similarities to characters. You would need actual strings of characters giving rise to words, phrases, sentences. That's how you demonstrate the presence of a particular language. And I would say it's a fairly objective question. In fact, let's set that as a rule of thumb, a helpful rule of thumb to keep in mind while going forward with this discussion. The presence of a marking which resembles a character employed in the script of a language is not by itself sufficient for demonstrating the presence of that language. The reason why it's important to keep that in mind is because, yes, there are certain markings on those pews that seem to resemble Hebrew cursive characters. However, they resemble all sorts of things. For example, the symbol that you currently see on your screen, or the marking that you currently see on your screen, to me, resembles a Greek omega. However, that is not enough that doesn't provide enough reason to think that the Greek language is present in these markings, that someone was writing in Greek. The fact that a marking resembles a Greek omega does not mean that the person who made the marking was writing in Greek, and the same applies to other languages. Yes, some of the characters might have somewhat resembled Hebrew cursive characters, but that in itself is not evidence of someone actually writing in Hebrew. Now, and this is an important point because I've looked at several pictures of these pews, and I personally cannot discern any obvious Hebrew text therein, any obvious Hebrew words or statements therein. To help illustrate this point, I quickly threw together this little sheet with scribblings on it. And at least the top two examples are from real experiences. So to begin, I'll zoom in on this line at the top. When I first took a course on Hebrew as an undergrad many years ago, we learned primarily using the cursive form because it's much easier to write using the cursive form. And in that first semester, in the very beginning, a couple of courses in, a couple of days in, when I first learned how to write the name David, Dalet wa Dalet, I quickly scribbled it down on a piece of paper in my notebook, on a page in my notebook. And later on that day, or maybe later on that week, I had that notebook open to that page sitting on a table in the apartment I was in. And a young lady that I was acquainted with at the time, who was a bit territorial, pointed to that text and asked me, whose phone number were you writing down here, right? Now, the reason she asked that is because and this is a true story, by the way, the reason she asked that is because the way that Dalet wa Dalet looks in Hebrew cursive, it resembles the numbers 212, which just happens to be the primary area code for Manhattan, and at the time I was living in Manhattan. Now, admittedly, in that case, actual Hebrew cursive was being confused for something else, for mere numerals, but the reverse could obviously be the case. Someone could write 212 in that form, and it would look like the cursive form for David, for the name David. It would look like Dalet wa Dalet, and yet it wouldn't actually be that. The mere resemblance of 212 to Dalet wa Dalet entails that not every case of 212 being written in that form is a case of Hebrew cursive being present. Anyway, let me jump to the next line and the next example, and this too is a real-world example. This too relates to another experience I had back when I was an undergrad many years ago. Someone had made a drawing, and the person wasn't a Muslim, but he was from a Muslim background, and he had made like a little cartoon, and the cartoon character was wearing a bandana, and this text, these symbols that you see on your screen, were written on his bandana. Now, someone else, another student who had been studying Hebrew cursive, relevant to this story, thought he saw some Hebrew there, some Hebrew cursive, and he actually asked, what was it that you were trying to write here? And he was saying that he could see there's an ayin there, there's a wa there, etc. Now, the reality is that no Hebrew cursive was present. This is actually an Arabic phrase that says, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah, or none deserves to be worshipped but Allah, but God. And the thing is, the lam alif combination, which appears twice on the page, looks like a Hebrew cursive ayin, and yet it's not an ayin. So too, the alif by itself, which is at the beginning of the word ilah, and also at the beginning of the word ilah, and at the beginning of the word Allah, the alif appears 3 times here, standing alone, not including with the lam before it. And it does look like a cursive Hebrew wa. And the point of this analogy, and this really did happen, this conversation, the point of it is that a person can think they see Hebrew cursive, and yet A, no Hebrew cursive is present, and B, no actual Hebrew is present. In other words, just because something looks like a Hebrew cursive character does not by itself establish that Hebrew or Hebrew cursive, much less, actual Hebrew, is present. And with that, now I can look at the last few examples on the bottom of the page. So to go through these 3 examples really quickly, at the top right, what is that? Is that the word one, or is that the Arabic word shams, transcribed into Hebrew characters? Like, for example, there's a Syrian village, unfortunately under occupation, called Majd al-Shams. Also, shams is the Arabic word for sun. So how would you know without the context? Is that just a sloppily written word one, or is that shams? On the left in the red, is that a face? Maybe someone was scribbling a face and they didn't finish it, or maybe it's a really sloppily written percent sign. Maybe someone was intoxicated when they were trying to write the percent sign. Or is that Hebrew cursive for the word for horse, sus? How would you tell? And at the bottom right, is that the 8th character of the Hebrew alphabet? Is that the chet in Hebrew cursive, or is that maybe that's a pi sign, the Greek pi, or maybe someone was drawing a square and they just didn't finish the bottom line? I hope these examples help to make the point that I'm trying to make, that seeing something that resembles Hebrew cursive characters does not in itself establish that actual Hebrew is present. So now let's return to the pews that are in the church. Here's a picture of one of the pews. What exactly are we looking at there? Now, admittedly, some of those lines do resemble an Arabic alif, and so too some of those lines resemble a Hebrew wa, including the way the wa is written in Hebrew cursive. However, I don't see anything in there which forms a coherent statement in either Arabic or Hebrew. Just because a portion of this marking resembles a character from Arabic or a character from Hebrew cursive does not mean that either Arabic or Hebrew are present. In order to demonstrate the presence of a language, you have to show something more than a mere similarity to a character. You have to show, strings of characters forming coherent words, phrases, and preferably sentences. Here's another page of scribblings which I'll use to attempt to illustrate this point. So, look at the different lines. I'll start by zooming in and looking at this first line right here. Okay, so this is Hebrew cursive, which is present, and it's also Hebrew text. It's the Hebrew language written in the Hebrew cursive. Those who know Hebrew will immediately recognize what it is. It's the first part of the Shema. It's the text of Deuteronomy 6:4, written in Hebrew cursive. From there, we can move on to the second line. This too employs the Hebrew cursive script, but if anyone who's familiar with Arabic would say, yeah, that's not Hebrew, that's actually Arabic. That's La ilaha illallah, which appeared earlier, only transcribed into the Hebrew cursive script. However, quick side note or asterisk, funny enough, 3 of the 4 words that appear on the page are also Hebrew words, even though they're pronounced differently in Hebrew and Arabic. The first 3 words, each of those can be found in the Hebrew language. So if we weren't sort of guided by knowledge of Arabic or guided by the popularity of the first part of the Shahada, of the Islamic creed of faith, we might say something else like, well, it's a Hebrew phrase with an Arabic word in it. It's, an Arabism or something like that. But whatever the case, the standard understanding of this for anyone who knew both the Hebrew script and the Arabic language was to say, yes, that's the Hebrew cursive script, but it's an Arabic phrase. Now from here we can quickly jump to the third line. And here again we have Hebrew cursive, but we don't have any Hebrew. We don't have any Arabic either. We don't have anything from a Semitic language. This is actually Yiddish, written in the Hebrew cursive, and there's nothing out of the ordinary about this. Plenty of Yiddish has been written in Hebrew cursive script. This actually reads, Ich will zu essen Latkes. I want something akin to I want to eat latkes. And the point of this analogy is, as was alluded to previously, even if you do have Hebrew cursive present, that doesn't mean you actually have Hebrew present, And of course, that would definitely be the case if you just have, this is the case if you have a full sentence, but if you just have some random markings that resemble Hebrew characters, Hebrew cursive characters, that doesn't mean that actual Hebrew is present or, even the Hebrew cursive script. But the point is, even the presence of Hebrew cursive doesn't mean the actual presence of Hebrew. Now, this is just a soft analogy, of course. I hope it goes without saying that I'm not accusing the persons who made those markings in the pews of writing Yiddish. I'm definitely not saying that. I don't really know Yiddish, but I don't see any discernible Yiddish there either. Of course, you could say, well, you don't know Yiddish, but you could probably find someone who actually knows Yiddish, and I'm confident they would tell you the same thing. And now, finally, let's go to the bottom line, which I feel is most analogous to what I see on those pews. First, look at that symbol, that cruciform symbol on the left. It looks like a plus sign. That looks like the Japanese character Ju for the number 10. However, is that enough to conclude that Japanese appears on the page? Do you believe that anyone who knows Japanese would conclude that these random scribblings constitute Japanese writing? Also, that same cruciform character, it looks like the Latin letter T a little bit, right? Doesn't it look like a lowercase t or even an X? Is that enough to conclude that English is here? Does this look like discernible English to you? The fact that the cruciform symbol resembles one of the characters used in English's employment of the Latin script, I'm sure you agree with me that that's not enough to conclude that therefore there's English writing here. Also on the right, you see that spiral? It sort of resembles the Hebrew cursive fe or pe, however you want to pronounce it, doesn't it? Also, there's something that looks like a backwards number 3. Maybe that's a reversed Hebrew cursive sade. Down at the bottom on the right, there's that, looks a little bit like that Hebrew dalet, cursive dalet, maybe tipped over on its side. But none of this is sufficient for concluding that Hebrew is present, or Aramaic is present, or Latin is present, or Vietnamese, or English, or Japanese, etc. This, I think, is the most analogous example of the examples that I've given. The previous examples were clear statements in Hebrew cursive, though in other languages, and you were able to discern what language was being employed based on the structure of the sentence, the way the strings of characters form words and phrases and so on. However, in this case, there is no discernible language here. And I think this is the most analogous example to what we see on those pews. As was stated earlier, yes, some of the markings on those pews might resemble a Hebrew cursive character. Some of them might resemble a Greek character. Some of them might resemble an Arabic character. But the mere resemblance to a single character here or there does not establish that actual language is present. I don't see any discernible statements in Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or Greek or whatever. Now, someone might reply that it doesn't matter if I don't see it or not, and that's fine. But for those who are asserting that either Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic is present, they should be able to demonstrate this. Demonstrating the presence of a language is not an esoteric art, or unless it shouldn't be, unless someone's going to argue that this is written in some sort of cryptic code. But if the argument is that this is discernible, obvious examples of Hebrew writing or Aramaic writing or Arabic writing, then it should be demonstrable. One should be able to point out the actual words, the actual sentences that are there. But if they can't do so, it begs the question, on what grounds are you asserting that Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic is present? And you can't just say, well, I heard that somebody else said so, or I read on the website that someone else said so. Or at the very least, you can't expect others to take it on faith simply because you heard it from somebody else or read that someone else made the claim. To claim that language is present, that claim should be backed up with some sort of demonstration, at least if you expect others to agree with you. Demonstrate the actual strings of characters giving rise to actual language, giving rise to words, to sentences, etc. Otherwise, we're left to wonder how this conclusion is being reached. Now, I just want to close here and say that I did not intend this video in any disrespectful way towards Pastor Kelly Richardson. I don't know the gentleman, and so I certainly have no reason to think ill of him, and so I certainly don't intend any sort of disrespect towards that gentleman, nor to anyone else who feels that Hebrew is present on these pews. I was just trying to explore the subject as objectively as possible. Objectively, personally, I feel that I don't see any grounds to think that any language is present in those markings. If others disagree, I would only ask that they present a case. Perhaps clarify what they see, transcribe what you see there, and let others examine, your transcription. Whatever the case, I look forward to the comments of others. I think this can make for an interesting discussion. And until then, either way, God bless.